afternoon session, after lunch session. I hope that you have your coffees. So we are starting. We will have three presenters in this session. So we are starting with Dan Lundberg, long-term member of ESEM. So it's my really pleasure to introduce him. He recently was appointed Director General of the Swedish Performing Arts Agency. It was in 2020.
Yeah.
This is just one of many other very important positions then occupied and doing very important research. So without further ado, Dan, please.
Yeah, thank you. You see, that's thanks very much for letting me come here and to speak for you. I will start, as you see, in Ukraine, and I will also end in Ukraine, but we'll do some excursions in the meantime. So that this song shall not die. This is a quote from a Bosnian song. Mother, you have to give birth to another daughter so that this song shall not die. I think it's very beautiful. It goes in two directions for me, both that it's two-part singing, but also keeping the traditions alive. The importance of culture and cultural heritage becomes even more obvious in times of crisis, whether caused by pandemics or military or political conflicts. Important cultural values represented by museums, archives, and libraries have been damaged during the war in Ukraine. This is not the first time, and it's not the last. So in this paper, I will not present ongoing research, but instead use the time to speak about two projects that where important musical cultural heritage have been saved from destruction through quite simple aid efforts, individual initiatives and collaborations. And I see this might serve as examples for future work. Well, first a little bit about the role of culture in political conflict situations. The newspaper Kiev Independent reported in June this year that nearly 600 libraries has been damaged in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that over 1,500 culturally valuable places have been damaged or destroyed. It's difficult to verify the data, especially since they come from very different sources, but here is the recent UNESCO figures on this. And you see, regardless of what the real numbers are, we can state that the war is not only about strategic military targets, but also about culture, of course. So you can ask yourself, why is cultural values in the firing line, and how can we protect ourselves against this? Firstly, it's of course because they are questions of identity, people's need for symbols and knowledge that made us what we are, and in that way cultural expressions can pose a threat to foreign powers as a unifying force for the defenders. You probably remember, I would take one of my favorite pictures and show you. You probably have seen it before. It's the young pianist Antoaneta Mishenko, a picture that was spread in all sorts of media around the world in connection with the Maidan protests in 2014. This picture you might have seen before. And I will quote from the Swedish newspaper where I saw this first. Quote, "It was in the beginning of February, and the days came with snow and temperatures below -20°C. In front of a barricade in central Kiev during the Euromaidan protests in 1914. A young pianist enters a flatbed of a truck where somebody plays the piano. On the square were the crowds of protesters, many who had camped in the square for months, and on the other side, the special police forces with shields in a sharp line, and you see them behind there. There was smoke about people's breath in the icy air, and she started to play Chopin's Etude number 12, the Revolution Etude. The military police set up loudspeakers playing Russian pop. trying to drown her out, but she didn't stop. I think it's so beautiful and terrible. It's a strong demonstration of the power of music and the bravery of a young individual. And we have seen many other similar images. I mean, from the Myanmar with singing hospital staff, and perhaps the most well-known examples, the singing revolution from the song festivals in the Baltics. So these are examples of how music can be both the unifying factor, but also means of communicating ideology or send messages to those outside. So I thought this might be a reminder to look back in history and reflect on what has been done regarding cultural heritage in previous situations of conflict. So in this paper I intend to present and discuss 2 examples. In both cases, cultural heritage material was transferred to us in Sweden and thus saved from destruction in conflict-affected areas. The first example is a collection of field recordings from the village 𝐭𝐡 in the Balkan Mountains in Bosnia that were collected in 1963 by the Swedish composer 𝟑𝟖 𝐭𝐡. 𝐭𝐡 was burnt down during the war in the early 90s, and today the village has been partially rebuilt, but the old village and its music now only exist in people's memories and in the songs of the archives. I know that some of you have heard about this before. I presented it at the conference in Montenegro a couple of years ago, which actually led to these 2 publications. There's a CD with 𝟑🖏 𝐭𝐡's field recordings, and also concert work that he wrote based on the recordings. And there is the book that our colleague Jasmina Talam and her colleagues in Sarajevo put together about stories about Bosnian music, dedicated then to 𝟑🖏 𝐭𝐡. The second example, I will just mention it now, we'll come back to that, is Lauro Ayasteran's folk music collections at the National Museum in Montevideo. The collection was copied and transferred to the museum in Stockholm in 1990. The reason was that people working with the collection felt that it was threatened by political powers. You know, this is just after the military junta, the military regime in Uruguay. And they were still scared that this will happen again. A few years later, the tapes, for some reason, disappeared from the archive, and we digitized them and returned the recordings in 2009. But first then, the Rabe collection. When 𝟑🖏 𝐭𝐡 died in 2017, his personal archive came to the Swedish National Collections of Music, Theatre and Dance. There were lots of interesting material there. For instance, these recordings from a field trip to Bosnia '63. The background to this, when Rabe had completed his composition studies in Stockholm, he was awarded a grant for composers. Such a grant is usually intended for you to go and visit a well-known composer in Rome or Paris or Berlin or somewhere. But Rabe was more interested in establishing contact with older folk music traditions. And he heard programs transmitted by the Swedish radio with strange, to his ear, very dissonant folk music from the Balkans. So he spoke to Ernst Emsheimer, at that time head of the Music Museum in Stockholm, who suggested him to contact Danish ethnomusicologist Birte Trerup, who had performed field studies primarily in Kosovo. So what he did, he put his equipment and his wife and whatever he could find into a Volkswagen Beetle, you know, this small, and drove all the way down, and came to Sarajevo and visited the Conservatory of Music and Professor Rittman. And Rittman promised him to find a door opener for them. And a few days later, they had contact with a former museum janitor, a pensioner. And this man came from the village 𝐭𝐡 in the Romania mountains, around 50 kilometers northeast of Sarajevo. So they went there, packed the Volkswagen again, and went up, and there were no roads. So the last kilometers they had to walk through the snow, and they came to the village. And it was a party because of their arrival. A rumor, I quote from Rabe's radio program he did. A rumor spread in the village that foreigners had come and they wanted to hear music. So within an hour, people gathered, and some brought along instruments, saraya, a long-necked lute, flutes with both single and double pipes, frula and dvojnice. Everyone in the village seemed to either play or both. In the big room of Omer's brother, that was the door opener, the big room measured 6 times 3.5 meters, and soon 40 to 50 people crowded together there. The ones who couldn't get in went around outside in the snow singing. We were to witness a cielo, a village music session. They explained to me that the men and women did not normally mix in the village, but since there were foreigners here with a scientific mission, they would relax their conventions. So they had a party going on, and they recorded 43 tunes during the night that was brought back to Sweden. In the late 1990s, Rabe composed an orchestral work for the Royal Stockholm Philharmonic Orchestra, a piece based on 2 of the songs recorded in 𝐭𝐡. And when the work had its premiere in 1999 in Stockholm, Rabe took part in one of the Swedish radio's international transmissions. He told of his trip to 𝐭𝐡 and asked listeners who knew anything about 𝐭𝐡 and its faith during the war to get in touch with him. And he was contacted by a Bosnian family who had fled to Sweden during the war and settled in the south of Sweden. The wife was born and bred in 𝐭𝐡, and she informed him that the village was burned down to the ground in 1992. These contacts led to Rabe traveling back there for a second visit. And at this time, they could drive all the way, but there were no signs of the old village because there were wooden houses, so everything was destroyed. So this was the story. And then we had a visit from Jasmina Talam in Stockholm, and we could hand over the recordings, the only recordings from the village. And I think it was a very nice thing, and this is the results of this. We should, of course, listen to something. This was what Rabe was, this is Sarajka Devojka, the girl from Sarajevo. Is that right? Yeah.
Yep, girl from Sarajevo.
Sarajka devojka, Hneci plakala, Sarajka devojka, Hneci plakala.
Now you understand why you have to buy the CD. It's good. And what Rabe did, a little piece of that too. This is his orchestral work with the Stockholm Symphony Orchestra. I'm not really sure where to find the songs. Yes. So the second example then is Lauro Ayasteran's folk music archive that was kept in the Museo Histórico Nacional in Montevideo. Ayasteran's field recordings were made during the 40s, 50s, and 60s and have a very high value, both scientific, documentary, and artistic. His recordings provide samples of music breath and musical artistry. And in some cases, the testimonies, the interviews stretch back as far as from the late decades of the 19th century. The collection consisted of reel-to-reel tapes, 212, and the archive also included a number of recordings made in 1974 by Walter Guido and Alejandro Ayestarán. And during the time of the military junta from 73 to 85, people at the museum in Montevideo were worried about the collection. All the material was, first of all, in bad condition, and it was clear that the archive would eventually be destroyed even without being subject to any kind of sabotage. And in that perspective, the idea raised of the possibility of eventually make additional copies of Ayestarán's recording to be preserved outside the country and made available in Uruguay in the future. The then director of the Music Museum in Stockholm, Christer Malm, became involved in the matter and prepared an application addressed to SIDA, Swedish International Development Authority, with a request for funds to digitize and return Ayestarán's archives to Uruguay. The application was approved and the tapes were migrated to DAT format. And when the collection came to Sweden 1990, as I said, the military regime had been replaced. But according to Christer Malm, there was a strong concern among Uruguayan musicologists that the military would once again take power. So when Christer then later contacted the colleagues in Montevideo in the beginning of 2000, the tapes had then disappeared, the original tapes from the archive. How, nobody knows. So in Sweden, he was able to digitize once again Laura Ayestarán's recordings and return the digital copies to Uruguay, now to the newly established Centro Nacional de Documentación Musical Laura Ayestarán. Of course, we will have to listen to here it is. We will listen a little bit to this nice, this is Aquilina Pia plays the accordion.
Pericón por Aquilino Pío.
1952. Should of course chosen a guitar recording to match the picture. So, to start to conclude this, what have we learned? Well, maybe that we should be doing this all the time. You have to try to predict the unpredictable. That's what I think about this kind of situations. In our times, this can be done in new ways and sometimes much easier. Not everything, but certainly what we can access online, for instance. So I want to conclude with showing you a good example of an effort that I like very much. This of the SUCHO, S-U-C-H-O, you know that? Saving Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Online. This is an initiative starting from three academics. One in Italy, actually, Sebastian Majstorovic, but also librarians and researchers in the US, to, on a voluntary basis, trying to save everything that could be saved on the internet from Ukrainian cultural heritage. This is the web page. Go there if you want to contribute. It's something that you could do very easily. In Sweden, this has been ongoing from Gothenburg University in the southwest of Sweden. And what they do there is not so much the collecting work, but to try to provide the Ukrainians with equipment. So the last thing I heard of that they managed to get a social scanner to the National Library in Kiev. A very valuable thing to do, I think, because then they could do the job themselves and upload it to this site. And this has actually turned into a fantastic Ukrainian cultural internet site where you can find almost everything, because now it's collected and put together. And I think just going on in this way, the safeguarding thing here is that it's kept outside of Ukraine, it's kept on different servers all around the world, and in many copies. So what you learned from the previous examples is take help from your friends and do it together and put it on different places. So here is a little bit more of information about Soho, maybe, in Swedish at least. And that's actually all for me. Thanks for listening.
Okay, so the floor is open. Comments, questions? Salva and then Tom. Just please wait for the mic. Salva.
Thank you so much. This is such an important point and the responsibility, and unfortunately the Ukraine is not the only place that lost so much. This morning I spoke of Aleppo, and I just, it really pains me, all what was lost, not to speak of Baghdad and many other war-torn places. I was just wondering if there is an effort on the part of UNESCO, because I remember in the ICTM conference in Vienna, we actually sent a letter to UNESCO asking for help, you know, to save these cultural losses, you know, that at least the material part, and there was no response. There was no response from UNESCO. And I think this is much more important than the ICH efforts that they're making, with all due respect and with total recognition of how in some situations it was actually very helpful to give value and project the so-called heritage, local heritage. So I was just wondering if you know whether UNESCO has any program, any efforts via Sweden or...
Yeah, I see what you mean. And actually I have not so much information. I know that via ICOM, you know, the museums in counterpart, they are now working with the Blue Shield idea to protect places and cultural heritage. But that's all I know about. And it's also debated whether or not this is a good way of marking out where your most vulnerable things are. It could be used the other way around. No, we have no help right now, at least, or contacts with UNESCO. Maybe the ICTM, maybe somebody here knows more about the ICTM's situation.
No, ICTM,
No.
But it is, I think, something that we all, in our own way and through our own channels, because this is the international organization for culture, and so I think that should be a mission, you know, an important mission.
Yeah.
Tom Solomon?
Thanks, Dan, for a really inspiring presentation. I have a practical question. You mentioned that the Uruguay collection was digitized and returned to Uruguay in format DAT, digital audio tape?
No. Yeah, when they arrived in Sweden in 1990, then at that time DAT was the best format, we thought. Then we did the whole process once again and made them into files, you know.
Oh, okay.
High resolution.
Sorry, I missed that.
Yeah,
I missed that.
Sorry, maybe I didn't say it.
Okay, thanks.
I'm just curious about this turn which somehow happened with this digital world we are living in now. So I'm also following some, let's say, bottom-up projects that people themselves are making online archives, uploading also via TikTok or some other, using really social media. So I was also thinking about some activities in the sense of at least collecting this, because we have, on one sense, we have archival sources, historical sources, which cannot be easily restored, and we have what's going on now, how people try somehow to document.
Yeah.
So I was also thinking maybe in this direction, how we can, or somehow can thinking about combining these websites where people put themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think in this respect, it's very easy. I mean, this work here is voluntary work with the SOCO, and I think many people are doing it all the time. We have so much collected material, but we have so little order.
Yeah.
So this is what it is today. We have so much here that we don't really know what we have.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the backside of the mass, mass something.
I came recently across a project where volunteers are involved in somehow safeguarding traditional stories. So people are dedicate their time to, upload something and work on these stories and provide. So it's kind of a crowdsourcing, So I think this is maybe also something to consider how it can be done with the help of people, of volunteers, of amateurs, people who are not professionals in music, or because we see in the case of Ukraine, these are cultural heritage professionals, but since we don't have any support from professionals, I think maybe rely on amateurs in that sense can be also something which is interesting to think of.
We did, this is not connected to what you were saying now, but we have done Wikipedia hacks at my institute, where we just said to people, if you're interested in this thing, we have done like unknown Swedish women composers who would like to write about, many people would like to write about them. So we get them together and we have a huge hack with maybe 50 people writing articles on Wikipedia. That's great, I think. And we've done so with some other things too. And maybe could also be a way of gathering people together. We also try to upload, do you say that, download? We put up as much material as we can on Wikimedia Commons, not keeping it in the archive, but just let it be out there to be used.
Okay, let's thank again to Dan. We have to proceed.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Tom Solomon, another long-term member of ESCM. He's a full professor at the Greek Academy at the University of Bergen, at the music department.
No.
So the title is Music and Displacement, Making Sense of a Terminological Mess. So. Yeah.
Thanks for the introduction, Anna. Okay, the impetus for this paper comes from conversations with a PhD student that I am currently supervising at the University of Bergen. And he's writing on music and the lives of people from Ethiopia and Eritrea who are living in Bergen, Norway. While he has a lot of rich empirical material from his fieldwork, he has struggled somewhat with the terminology that can be used to characterize this population. Should he call them a diaspora, or should he refer to them as migrants, Are they an ethnic group? Many, but not all of these people have a claim to the legal category of refugee. And might at least some of these people be characterized as exiles? Such questions suggest that there is much at stake in the labels that we use to refer to displaced populations and individuals, and the terms we use when discussing the myriad relationships between music and displacement. I am, of course, not the first to note the terminological quandary we find ourselves in. John Bailey and Michael Collier already noted in 2006 that, quote, migrants are characterized in a whole array of different ways. Immigrants, internal, international, forced, voluntary, economic, labor, refugees, internally displaced, stateless, or exiles. The list goes on, end quote. They continue by noting that the criteria are inexact and the boundaries extremely blurred. Bailey and Collier end up arguing that where there is no practical need, it does not appear to be particularly useful or helpful to categorize individuals in these ways. Despite their skepticism, the terminology applied to displaced people continues to proliferate. In this paper, I will try to trace some path through some of the terms used to categorize displaced people, disentangling the terms and exploring the dimensions of meaning that contrast them with each other. My discussion is necessarily idiosyncratic and exploratory. I draw on a small, even tiny subset of the vast literatures on the topics of displacement more generally and music and displacement more specifically. I limit the discussion for now to English language terms used in some of the relevant scholarly literature, and I dedicate this very tentative and unfinished paper to Adelaida Reyes, a pioneer in the study of music and displacement. I can only hope that this small contribution achieves a fraction of the clarity and rigor that Adelaida's work consistently demonstrates. Due to time constraints, I will focus on just 4 of the key terms within this large semantic complex, namely migrant, migration, and their various subterms, diaspora, refugee, and exile, though I will also refer in passing to some other related terms, such as ethnicity, transnationalism, and post-colonialism. Because the terms we use are inevitably historically, socially, and culturally contingent in their origins and meanings, none of them can be neutral. As you may have already noticed from my title and opening remarks, I choose to at least provisionally use the term displacement as the most general encompassing term, under which the other terms can be organized as special types of the more general phenomena. This is because displacement seems, at least to me, to be, for better or worse, the most dispassionate or abstract of the terms currently in use. The first terms extensively theorized in social scientific and ethnomusicological literatures to discuss music in the context of displacement were migration, for the social phenomenon, and migrants, for the people. These terms were used most often in the sociological literature on ethnicity, especially in urban contexts, and I'm thinking of writings from the 1970s, where ethnic groups exist and interact with other social groups. Adelaida Reyes, in an early article titled Ethnic Music, the Urban Area and Ethnomusicology from 1979, followed anthropologist Frederick Barth, 1969, by framing her arguments in terms of ethnicity. But she quickly found that, given their particular urban context in the US that she was dealing with, New York City, she could not discuss ethnicity without also discussing migrants and migration, since in the empirical context she was working in, ethnicity most often emerged in the relationships between migrants and their host societies, as well as between different migrant groups with roots in different places. Reyes critiqued earlier studies that took as their point of departure a set of assumptions and methodologies regarding pre-migration culture, including music, and its retention or loss in the context of migration. The terms migration and migrants are somewhat slippery in terms of where they fit into international legal frameworks. The United Nations notes that, quote, While there is no formal legal definition of an international migrant, most experts agree that an international migrant is someone who changes his or her country of usual residence, irrespective of the reason for migration or legal status. Generally, a distinction is made between short-term or temporary migration, covering movements with a duration between 3 and 12 months, and long-term or permanent migration, referring to a change of country of residence for a duration of 1 year or more, end quote. Moving beyond sociological and international legal frameworks, ethnomusicology has explored the cultural dimensions of migration and the musical lives of migrants. An exemplar of this approach is Toynbee and Dueck's edited collection published in 2011, in which they choose to use migrants and migration as the umbrella terms. The organizing trope for the collection, migrating music, is intended to cover the movements of both people, migrants, and of musical objects, styles, genres, instruments, performance techniques. Under migrants, they include people who move physically to new places, both musicians and listeners, and who are moving voluntarily and involuntarily, temporarily and permanently, with papers and without. In their introduction to the collection, Toynbee and Dueck enumerate and sketch out a number of cultural processes relevant for the complex they call migrating music, including mediation, translation, and mimesis, which I unfortunately do not have time to discuss further here. Under the general heading of migration can be placed the special cases of transit migration and forced migration. A publication by the UN defines transit migration as, quote, migration to a country with intention of seeking the possibility there to immigrate to another country as the country of final destination by means that are partially, if not fully, illegal. Legal transit migration is a normal phenomenon, end quote. The UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights further notes that, quote, there is no authoritative definition of transit migration. The term is commonly taken to mean the temporary stay of migrants in one or more countries with the objective of reaching a further and final destination. Yet it is important to appreciate that the notion of temporariness embodied in the concept of transit is conceptually changing. How long or short is the transit period? After what length of stay does the transit country become the final destination? End quote. 👑🖑 𐭭𝐡 has called attention to how transit migration has been overlooked within ethnomusicological research. She notes that, quote, transit communities have remained at the margins of migration studies in ethnomusicology because they tend to not stay in the transit region long enough to create new musical styles or establish strong enough bonds with the host culture to create hybrid musical products that ethnomusicologists can study, end quote. She draws on her own work on music among Chaldean Iraqi transit migrants in Istanbul, arguing that the uncertain conditions and, quote, limbo of unsettledness, end quote, under which transit migrants live, lead them to develop ad hoc strategies to cope with the difficulties they face, and these strategies deserve more attention in research. Writing in several significant publications since the early 1990s, Adelaida Reyes argued that the distinction between voluntary migration and involuntary migration is crucial to understanding the roles music plays in displaced populations. Reyes uses the terms involuntary migration and forced migration interchangeably, and she also uses the terms forced migrant and refugee more or less interchangeably. In the same special journal issue on the topic of forced migration that Adelaida's early paper on the topic appeared in, Ingrid Monson, however, includes also the historical enslavement and transportation of kidnapped Africans to destinations in Europe and the Americas as a kind of forced migration. These populations would, however, not usually be considered as refugees. And I'll return to the term refugee a bit later in this presentation. The term with perhaps the largest associated literature, both generally and specifically in relation to music, is diaspora, One might say that diaspora in music became something of a paradigm in music studies around the turn of the millennium. I've written about this before, and my remarks here draw on that already published material. The classic statement regarding the diaspora as a social formation is that of William Safran. Sorry, lost my place. Who rigorously defined the term in an essay in the first issue of the first academic journal dedicated to diaspora studies. Safran defines diasporas as, quote, expatriate minority communities whose members share several of the following 6 characteristics. 1, they or their ancestors have been dispersed from a specific original center to 2 or more peripheral or foreign regions. 2, they retain a collective memory, vision, or myth about their original homeland, its physical location, history, and achievements. 3, they believe they are not, and perhaps cannot be, fully accepted by their host society, and therefore feel partly alienated and insulated from it. 4, they regard their ancestral homeland as their true ideal home and as the place to which they or their descendants would or should eventually return when conditions are appropriate. 5, they believe that they should collectively be committed to the maintenance or restoration of their original homeland and to its safety and prosperity. And 6, they continue to relate personally or vicariously to that homeland in one way or another, and their ethno-communal consciousness and solidarity are importantly defined by the existence of such a relationship. End quote. Safran's distinction thus puts special focus on the role of culture in forging the complex relationships that displaced groups have with their ancestral homelands. Drawing on Safran, Thomas Torino makes a typological distinction between different kinds of what he calls social formations, identifying 3 types: immigrant communities, diasporas, and cosmopolitans, the first 2 of which are the most immediately relevant for the discussion here. Torino uses the 2 dimensions of spatial and temporal spread to distinguish between them. According to Torino, immigrant communities span connections between, not sure how that happened. Sorry, I got ahead of myself there. Immigrant communities span connections between only 2 specific places, the homeland and the host society, and they tend to assimilate and fade away within a few generations. Diasporas, on the other hand, are characterized by connections between multiple sites, more than 2, and they tend toward longevity and recognition of social continuities across space and time. Torino also distinguishes between immigrant communities and diasporas in terms of processes of identity formation. Since around the mid-1990s, the work of Safran and others has spawned a rich and extensive scholarship on the cultural dimensions of diaspora, much of which focuses on music. Diaspora became a key term in cultural theory as researchers developed different heuristics for exploring the special nature of diasporic culture and diasporic spaces, especially in post-colonial contexts, such as Homi Bhabha's concept of the third space and Paul Gilroy's theorization of the Black Atlantic. Diasporic music and culture have especially been approached through the lens of hybridity. Torino argues, for example, that, quote, hybridity is basic to the very character of diasporic cultural formations because of the ways subjectivities emerge and the ways subjectivity intersects with identity. While diaspora as a concept continues to have currency in research, I would argue that it has begun to yield place to the concept of refugee, to which I will turn now. Of all the terms that I discuss here, refugee is the one with the most developed international legal framework. It has also become a highly loaded term, a point to which I will return shortly. Article 1 of the 1951 United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees, as amended in the 1967 Protocol, defines a refugee as, quote, a person who is outside his or her country of nationality or habitual residence, has a well-founded fear of persecution, because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, and is unable or unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country or to return there for fear of prosecution, end quote. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees further explains that refugees are persons who are outside their country of origin for reasons of feared persecution, conflict, generalized violence, or other circumstances that have seriously disturbed public order and as a result require international protection, end quote. Refugee thus started its recent terminological life as a legal category, but has more recently become a political, politicized, and institutional category as different states argue their interests in relation to contemporary and ongoing flows of refugees that challenge the very nature of the post-Westphalian nation-state system, with its regimes of citizenship and the strict policing of borders. As Christidis notes, refugee has also increasingly become a matter of sentiment. The constant flow of news reports about boatloads of people lost at sea and the heart-rending photographs of the bodies of children washed up on the shores of the Mediterranean clearly have given the legal label refugee an emotional resonance and sense of urgency, like none of the other terms discussed here. As I discussed earlier, the term refugee is also closely associated with migration, especially forced migration. The currency of these terms in ethnomusicology can be seen in numerous papers and panels given at international conferences, such as the two SEM Presidents' Roundtables on ethnomusicological responses to the contemporary dynamics of migrants and refugees, held at the 2016 and 2017 meetings of the Society for Ethnomusicology, and the publication of papers from the 2016 Roundtable in SEM's journal in 2019. Refugee, along with a new uptick in the use of the terms migrants and migration, seems to have taken the reins from diaspora as researchers struggle with the political realities of displacement and try to respond with the appropriate urgency given the situation, especially in the wake of the so-called 2015 migrant crisis. It is no coincidence, I think, that 👑🖑 𐭭𝐡's article, The Short History of Syrian Street Music in Istanbul, was announced as ICTM's 2022 Article of the Year. In the same inaugural issue of the journal Music and Minorities that her article appears in, Marco Kolbel offers a nuanced discussion of what he calls refugees as academic fashion in his article Ethnomusicology, Fieldwork, and the Refugee Experience. Kolbel means this not to disparage research on the topic, but to acknowledge the thorny politics of relatively privileged academic researchers doing research on very vulnerable people. This trend is only set to continue as researchers also begin to recognize and take account of the relatively new category of climate refugee or climate change refugee as a new kind of forced migrant. The last term that I will discuss in this presentation is exile. While exile can be used in relation to both individual persons and to larger social groupings, such as the deportation and exile of the Crimean Tatars in the Soviet Union in the mid-1940s, its associations are generally less with social formations, sociological analysis, legal frameworks, and transnationalism, and more about an existential state or a kind of subjectivity that the displaced person inhabits. As discussed by Edward Said, himself an exilic subject. Sorry, missing a slide apparently. As discussed by Edward Said, exile has a long history as a literary trope. Exile is good to think with. In his chapter on German exile studies in the edited volume Music and Displacement, Shedding notes that, quote, the German exil, like the English exile, can be traced back to the old Latin exilium and exul, glossed as banishment and a banished man, respectively. The negative connotation is even stronger in later shifts in the meaning of the word, as in the Old French exilier or exilier, to ravage, to devastate, or in the contemporary English exterminate, meaning literally to drive beyond boundaries. Etymologically, then, exil means displacement in the narrower sense of the word, that is, enforced and involuntary movement from one place to another. As Bailey and Collier note, quote, "The exile has long been a powerful image in literature and art, a homeless wanderer cut off from the source of cultural authenticity, condemned to endless repetition of half-remembered practices. The state of belonging, neither here nor there, but some mixture of the two, has been fully explored in work on transnational communities." So far in this discussion, I have tried to identify some of the ways the terms migration, diaspora, refugee, and exile have been defined and used in the scholarly literature. My aim has been to compare and contrast these terms, teasing out their different nuances of meaning, where they overlap and where they are distinct from each other. In a discussion of the development of the field of urban ethnomusicology, Adelaida Reyes critiques what she calls, quote, certain habits of mind, which she defines as ways of thinking that become so embedded in normal practice that they are taken for granted, and by virtue of having become habits, escape critical scrutiny. Overlooked and hence unacknowledged, they are not addressed. Virtually unexamined, they continue in effect even when new data and new knowledge dictate a change or a re-evaluation, end quote. In the spirit of Adelaida's critique, I would like to step one level back and get even more meta about this already meta-theoretical discussion of terminology for music and displacement. A so far unspoken premise motivating my discussion is that the terms of scientific discourse should be rigorously and consistently defined. Terminology should be precise, unambivalent. But what if this striving for rigor and precision in language actually leads to less nuance? Social scientist and philosopher John Law, who works primarily within the field of science and technology studies, has argued that the complexities of the world require a new approach to method, acknowledging what he calls mess. Law writes, quote, "My intuition, to say it quickly, is that the world is largely messy. It is also that contemporary social scientific methods are hopelessly bad at knowing that mess. Indeed, it is that dominant approaches to method worked with some success to repress the very possibility of mess. They cannot know mess except in their aporias as they try to make the world clean and neat. So it is my concern to broaden method, to imagine it more imaginatively, to imagine what method and its politics might be if it were not caught in an obsession with clarity, with specificity, and with the definite," end quote. My closing remark, in the spirit of John Law's critique, is that while the whole enterprise of trying to define terms precisely so that different phenomena can be compared and contrasted with each other represents an attempt to impose order on an inherently messy social and cultural field, as if it were, in Law's terms, clean and neat. Perhaps the terminological mess of music and displacement is actually useful to us, as in its failure to precisely define the phenomena reminds us that the world of displacement, the world of migrants, diasporas, refugees, exiles, is itself inherently complicated and indeed messy. To embrace the mess is not to give up on understanding human experience. It is to recognize the contingency of the social world, especially a world characterized by the constant movements of displaced peoples, no matter what label you apply to them. Thank you.
Questions, comments? Lisa? And then Salva?
Hi, thank you so much. This was so interesting, and I have a lot of thoughts. I do want to raise a maybe, critical comment and see what you respond to it. To the mainly to Safran's definition of diasporas, which I think is problematic in the sense that it has this very strong focus on homeland orientation, and through that it also becomes. Well, first of all, one could argue about kind of methodological nationalism and a kind of centering of the homeland, whereas for a lot of the classical diasporas, at least, that is not, was not the case in a pre-nation state kind of world. But then I would also say that specifically what Paul Gilroy and other kind of more post-colonial or critical theory scholars of diaspora are doing is precisely to undermine this very almost quantitative notion of diaspora. So I was wondering what you think about this debate, basically, about kind of counting diasporas versus diaspora as a stance, as Rogers Brubaker calls it, or kind of like diaspora as a political stance.
Yeah. Very good question, thank you. And a lot of issues that I would expand on if I had time. So if I do it's never final, but a written version of this, those are certainly some issues that I would include. The classical diasporas, of course, date from before the Westphalian nation-state system, right? But they still have to do with a tie to the homeland. So it was long before that there was ever a concept of a state that, for example, the Jews considered Israel as the promised land, right? It's a home that all want to eventually return to, at least in a theoretical sense, if not in actual practicality. And then we can see the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 as an example of that, then intersecting with legal frameworks as well, and sort of what to do about diaspora after the modern nation-state system. And other more recent diasporas, what has later been called the African diaspora, although it wasn't originally conceptualized in that sense by people, because Africa itself is a fairly modern concept. The Armenian diaspora, much more recently. So all of these have to do with, once they get incorporated into the modern system, then it becomes a right to have a state. And to have that state's borders be recognized internationally and not be allowed for those borders to be violated. The second half of your question, yes, of course, states are as much a concept, an idea, even an ideal type, as they are a practicality, because we can see all the time everywhere around in the world, one nation is crossing the border, one state is crossing the borders of another state to claim territory, to claim people or whatever. It's important to find this connection and acknowledge again how messy it is, this relationship between the state as a legal framework and then homeland or promised land, or the land that you come from, the land your ancestors come from, that you have an emotional attachment to. So those sort of exist on parallel tracks that sometimes intersect each other depending on current events. So I hope I addressed your very nuanced and useful question. Thank you. I think Salva was
Salva,
next.
yes, just here.
Thank you so much, and thank you for paying tribute to Adelaide, who was also my teacher, and so I remember not just from reading her, but from being in her classes, her critical stance and her insistence on clarifying concepts. My question has to do with translation. Many of us here work in more than one language. And even those of us who try to work outside European language, languages face tremendous problems grappling with these concepts, with these and other concepts. So I just wonder whether you have any comment or any experience to share with us working with languages other than English, which, I mean, as you point out, the world is a mess, and so the messiness that we have to take into account. But anyhow, if you can comment about.
Yeah, one of my ideas for a further expansion of this would be to add a section that's a sort of case study of one sort of linguistic constellation, and that is in Turkish, since I have some knowledge of the language and of the social and cultural setting and of its diasporas. So there's a term, I think it's actually originally from Arabic, gurbet, which translates a lot of things, and then at the same time, on any of the things that it translates, like migrant or diaspora. Sometimes even the term diaspora is now also being used in Turkish as a borrowed term, but at the same time doesn't really translate because gurbet has a much more sort of emotional association. So it includes within it, to a certain extent, the idea of exile, of being away from your homeland and that you have an emotional attachment to, but you can't go back for whatever reason. So yeah, that's a really good, this is very Anglophone-centric in the literature that I choose to work on, to include Europe, because otherwise then it just gets huge. You would have a bibliography longer than the article if I were to really pursue that. But that is a very good critique. Thank you.
Thank you.
Last question, Pirko Mujsala.
Actually, this is not a question, but first I want to thank you for the thought-provoking talk. Really wonderful, thank you.
Thanks,
But
Pirko.
then my comment is that this, of course, it plays the strings in my mind on a very thin ice of becoming really cynical about doing anything, because when we work with other cultures, other languages, and at least for me as a scholar on indigenous people, I have used my decades in trying to understand another way of existing, thinking, knowledge formation, everything. And then, of course, and we all work with music and try to write music in words. So the cynical thing becomes that, well, let's leave these words and go and play.
Yeah. Well, I think there's room for lots of different kinds of scholarship and approaches to building knowledge and using knowledge within academia. So there can be much more sort of applied things, and then the occasional meta-theoretical intervention, can be useful too. If it's not your thing, then maybe that's a good time to go out and get a coffee or have a conversation with a colleague in the hallway about something that's more relevant. So, but I hear you.
Okay, so thank you again, Tom, for this wonderful paper. And our last speaker in this session is Samuel Wiegel, coming from the University of Hanover. He's a PhD student and also research assistant and in musicology. So we will now turn to another topic related to Jewish music.
Perfect presentation is on screen, so I'd like to start. So thank you so much for the opportunity to give you an insight into my current doctoral research project. I'm still in the middle of my fieldwork and also look forward to your feedback. And in the following, I will talk about Jewish liturgical music in online environments from a critical heritage studies perspective. Okay, I've got here a pop-up. Okay, now continue. So my PhD project is embedded in the overall project called Knowledge Architecture, which is funded by the German Research Foundation, DFG, as part of the priority program called Jewish Cultural Heritage. The priority program is also concerned with an interdisciplinary critical examination of the concept of Jewish cultural heritage, and our project focuses on the respective structures of heritagization at various levels, ranging, as you see, by the area studies from communal perspectives to the role of political institutions, heritage initiatives in academia, and also Jewish liturgical music is one area of investigation. So as in recent years more and more Jewish communities began to shift parts of their service online, I'm interested in how digitality in these environments is changing the way liturgical music is performed, transmitted, and also renegotiated by focusing on structures, practices, and digital tools. Jewish liturgical music is therefore here understood as a kind of living heritage, and in particular my case studies focus on several local trans-denominational worship communities here called online minyanim that are situated within Jewish renewal and reconstructionism. Methodologically, I approach these questions with a hybrid ethnography by conducting qualitative interviews and doing participant observation in several communities online, also following their networks and institutions. So to clarify some central terms with post-denominationalism, that's a term that depicts movements that reject denominational affiliation, so the major streams in Judaism, seeking for new approaches, and in addition these communities are often formed around personal connections. Trans-denominationalism emphasizes more the openness across a spectrum of Jewish denominations rather than to reject them. And by Jewish renewal, I refer to a trans-denominational stream in Judaism that emerged in the late 1960s in the United States, and that has been strongly influenced by various religious, political, and ecological movements, such as the counterculture of the 1960s, also New Age spirituality, and the neo-Hasidic teachings of the founder, Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, all in all with the aim also of renewing Jewish religious experience at many levels. By the term musical heritage of the synagogue, I refer to several dimensions. So at an object level, this can include practices and artifacts that have been accorded heritage status, for example, by members of Jewish communities, religious authorities, but also by heritage experts. On the material side, this incorporates things like prayer books, musical scores, recordings, and to a certain extent musical instruments. And on the intangible side, this includes the transmitted repertoire performed in worship, such as traditional mode-like frameworks of chanting prayers, nusachim, congregational melodies and liturgical text, or the overall composition of the liturgy itself. So on a meta level and following the field of critical heritage studies, the processes of heritagization should also be taken into account by asking questions of how, by whom, and with what intentions musical heritage is mobilized by the various actors, for example, as a cultural political resource or otherwise as an expression of belonging or distinction, for example. This kind of deconstructivist stance within that field was a reaction to the dominating expert-led heritage practice of the UNESCO and to related conceptions of heritage as something static, often tangible, and often ascribed with universal values. So that are conceptions that have been discussed and changed over the past decades. Especially in public and cultural policy, tangible manifestation or to particular forms of practice, like in Germany to the music of the pre-Shoah German Jewish reform movement. So something that resembles only a small aspect of the heterogeneous and vivid nature of contemporary communal realities. And to emphasize the performative nature of liturgical musical heritage as an integral aspect of worship, I understand it as a living cultural heritage that, in the sense of Laura Jane Smith, is constantly something in flux, renegotiated, and also adapted to the needs of the present and the future by a wide variety of stakeholders. Now, looking at this Heritage Online, there's a wide variety of professional and community-driven databases, repositories, and other initiatives by archives, museums, cantors of Chazanim, as well as other stakeholders, and also social media platforms or platforms like YouTube are used to share a huge amount of cantorial music, both live and recorded. However, if we broaden the definition of heritage, we need to consider websites not only as repositories of knowledge, but also as sites where heritage is negotiated and lived through performance. And since the last decade, particularly within non-Orthodox Judaism in the US, an increasing number of congregations had started streaming their services over the internet using video conferencing software. And especially during the 2019 pandemic, communities around the world had to deal with streaming technologies and with also adapting their services to ensure ongoing religious life as far as it was possible. And although most communities have returned to offline practice, some continued online prayer service. So there have already been theorization of digital transformations of religious life, and building on Manuel Castell's Network Society, a macro-social approach to how globalization and digitality formed the so-called Network Society, Heidi Campbell's approach, Networked Religion, offers a fruitful concept of the overall appropriation of digital culture within and across religions. Therefore, she identifies 5 dimensions where transformation can take place. So, following her argumentation, community members in networked religion tend to participate in multiple, hybrid, fluid, and multi-sided networks, where the degree of involvement is also highly variable. These networks can also offer viable alternatives to local religious power structures by mobilizing on and offline sources, drawing on a broader palette, and also drawing on a broader palette of religious narratives online. In this regard, this can also lead to an increasing personalization of religious experience. Nevertheless, digital religious practice often does not replace offline practice, but rather supports and extends local form of worship. So now, drawing on my ongoing fieldwork, I'd like to share different perspectives on how liturgical musical heritage and its practice are being adapted to online environments. And although these examples represent only particular and processual glimpses into a broader transformation of religious practice in specific parts of Judaism, they give a sense of the creative ways in which digital culture is being engaged and the benefits and challenges it can offer. So, the first case, or the first minyan, is a virtual European minyan. It's an egalitarian and trans-denominational worship communities with links to Reconstructionism and Jewish renewal, and members from all across Europe and the US, and it's hosted from Frankfurt in Germany. So the leading cantors and rabbis organize monthly online Sunday Ma'ariv services that are attended by regularly 5 to 15 people of the 60 persons on their mailing list. The minyan is also closely linked to a weekly online Friday night service led by one of the leading cantors called the Synagogue. Another online minyan that was pointed out to me by an interview was Minyan Oneg Shabbat, which began offline and moved online with the onset of the pandemic, and now has over 300 people on its membership directory and about 40 to 50 people attending the weekly Saturday morning services, and they consider themselves as a Jewish renewal community and are mainly based in the United States and Canada. So while MOSH, as the abbreviation, regards itself as a full online synagogue experience, the other two minyanim aim to function more as a supplement to local synagogue life. And also I'd like to, I took an institution into account. So as an institution that deals with the transmission of synagogue traditions, the European Academy for Jewish Liturgy, EGIL, is a trans-denominational academy without walls that are offering several online courses and programs, and has also several connections to the virtual European Minyan. So what stood out for me especially was the aspect of active participation within the service that plays a central role in all 3 online minyanim. So many of the cantors interviewed criticized the fact that services are often too concert-like in other synagogues, especially live stream service, which often do not allow much interaction. And in principle, participation in 3 minyanim is as follows. So a cantor leads through service, but congregants are encouraged to take over parts of the service also at any time. And because of the latency, usually only one person praying is unmuted. And in exceptional cases, prayers are said or sung together with all microphones on. The opportunity to turn off audio and video also allows the community to choose the degree of involvement they feel comfortable with. And also between the prayers, it is encouraged to ask questions about liturgy or to discuss prayer contents and parashat. So this mode of online participation serves several purposes. So first of all, the translocality of the virtual synagogue space enables people with physical disabilities or those without connection to a local synagogue to participate in communal prayer, which is the core concern of the virtual European Minyan and the Synagogue. And as mentioned before, both minyanim are also open spaces to share liturgical melodies and nusach. And in this regard, parts of the liturgy are also explained and discussed to new participants so that people from different denominational backgrounds can learn and understand the minhag, the custom of the online community. In addition to participation in the creation of discursive spaces, immersion in the service also fulfills the function of community building, so the practice of what they call not breakout rooms but breakthrough rooms at Mosh allows the creation of an open space during the service where personal anecdotes and thoughts on the weekly Torah portion can be shared, for example, in small groups. Also, the opportunity to say Kaddish online and to pray for ill friends and family members contributes to the feeling of being heard and being part of what one rabbi calls a caring community. In general, these Zoom services are very inclusive, not only in terms of welcoming people of all genders, ages, and other backgrounds, but also in terms of the composition of the network itself. So mostly the community studies are based on interest and also friend-based networks. And as one rabbi said, those who find their spiritual home tend to stay. In all 3 minyanim, the challenges of digital environments such as reduced attention span, Zoom fatigue, spiritual immersion is attempted through various creative means, and there is usually no one-to-one adaptation of online practice. So in some cases, new prayers are introduced, and in case of Mosh, the central Torah reading is replaced by the aforementioned practice of breakthrough rooms that is accompanied by a short cantillation of central Torah portions. Also, similarly, tools such as screen sharing, video feeds are implemented. Also, the chat follows the function of giving page references for orientation during the services. Also, conflicts with Jewish traditions, such as the questions of how to count a minyan online or when to light Shabbat candles, by having multiple location or time zones, are dealt in rather pragmatic ways, following the renewal founder Shachter Shalom's maxim, the only way to get it together is together. Mosh is also choosing musical approaches that differ from traditional ways of praying, so in this regard the focus is on melodies from popular music and Jewish renewal, chazanim, and a few passages were chanted in traditional nusach. Most of the prayers are accompanied by piano, bass, and guitar arrangement played live by the leading cantorist and shared via specific software and an audio interface. And although the musical transformation by opening up the melodic repertoire within Jewish renewal is something that predicts the shift to online practice, digital technologies are well synergizing with that practice by bridging the personal distance of face-to-face Zoom calls through low threshold participation and shifting the emphasis on individual involvement. The other 2 minyanim have mainly agreed on the Ashkenaz style nusach of certain renewal cantor Jack Kessler, and in terms of non-nusach-based parts of the service, they vary and spontaneously decide whether to sing traditional or renewal melody, and in this regard the range of liturgical melodies also extends from traditional synagogue modes and songs to melodies also inspired by popular music. So the increasing availability of digital resources, form of databases and video platforms, for example, is in some ways democratizing knowledge of liturgical music, for example, through cantorial recordings on YouTube that can help congregants learn aspects of the liturgy. Other online sources are providing learning aids for Torah cantillation and function as a preparation for life cycle events such as B'nai or B'not Mitzvah. And in the Minyanim, this is being used in a variety of ways, which participants using online resources to support learning, as well as cantors being able to make open source prayer books and recordings available to their members. And despite these benefits, the long-term access of these resources often remains unclear, so beneath issues of long-term storage, copyright issues, and also dependence on tech companies, and the intransparency of a lot of resources, that are all factors that certainly can pose a threat to a future sustainable usage. Nevertheless, these resources are successfully used as a supplement to facilitate active participation in worship and to promote openness to the heterogeneity of Jewish musical traditions. And in addition to digital resources, there are, as I mentioned, so-called Academy Without Walls, so educational institutions for religious professionals and committed community members that aim to teach liturgical practice. So most of the cantors and rabbis interviewed received their ordination through Aleph, that's the umbrella organization for Jewish renewal, whose training is largely online, and also a fact that have certainly helped these communities in coping with the effects of the pandemic. And some of the interviewers are also involved in the European Academy for Jewish Liturgy, and in particular, 𝐄𝐻𝐾𝐡's programs specialize in the musical and religious know-how needed to lead a service, but also in the social skills needed to work with the community. And also 𝐄𝐻𝐾𝐡's translocal networks of experts makes it possible not only to provide cantors for congregations throughout Europe, but also to respond to specific communal needs, such as in one case the requested reintroduction of Litvish Nusach in a Finnish congregation, or the revival of an old Catalan prayer tradition in another. With its trans-denominational and translocal approach, they offer education independent of local and established institutions, as well as denominational barriers. And in addition to cantorial training, 𝐄𝐻𝐾 also helps communities without Jewish professionals to build sustainable structures by teaching them the basic of prayer leading, also using online tools. The case studies illustrate some of the characteristics of networked religion. Thus, in terms of transmission and education, individuals and institutions can use digital culture to form effective networked communities, to share knowledge of liturgical traditions, to connect communities, to connect cantors and congregations around the world, and sometimes also to revive former local traditions. Therefore, worship experience and education can be experienced multi-sided. Regarding shifting authority and the aspect of storied identities, websites and organizations such as 𝐄𝐻𝐾 can function as an alternative to established institutions of cantorial education, offering resources for individualized long-distance learning of musical traditions. Also, the pandemic acted as a catalyst for some to integrate hybrid practices in their communal life, or even to move them entirely online, as in the case of Mosh. In regard to the virtual European Minyan, online practice functioned more as a complement to offline religious life as depicted in networked religion. All in all, rabbis and cantors have found creative ways to bridge major technical gaps in participation by converging practices, experimenting with congregational singing and worship leading, as well as with the plurality of Jewish musical heritages on and offline. Jewish musical heritage here manifests as a diverse, non-static phenomenon that is not only negotiated within cultural political discourses, local synagogue communities, networks, but also as something that is mediated and transformed as a living practice in digital space. So thank you so much for attending my presentation. I would be happy to hear your feedback, comments, and also to answer your questions as good as I can in my current phase of research.
So questions, comments? Britta?
Sure.
Just wait, please, because we are going online.
Okay, so thanks a lot for this very rich and dense material. And I was just wondering, is there also something that is not working in an online format?
Not working. Sure, the aspect of singing together, like synchronous praying, is difficult because you have this time delay. So that is difficult. So they have to adapt to that and to find a way that one person is leading the prayer, the other are singing along but muted, and so there are things that are not working. Or like, they had difficulties with the whole aspect of Torah reading in the Saturday services, so they try to find some workaround that kind of austauschen, kind of exchange that.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit more about the virtual fieldwork situation that you found yourself in? Because obviously you're taking part, and this opens questions about your positionality, also within the community. Maybe a little bit more info on that.
Sure. Since these communities are mostly doing the services on online and meeting on Zoom, so I contacted the leading cantors and try to explain what I'm doing, why I'd like to attend, and then they introduced me to the community, and I logged into Zoom and tried to participate as far as possible. So not as a person lurking there in the Zoom call without turning my camera off, but be present there so that they're aware that I'm also here attending.
And your background is also Jewish, or?
No, my background is not Jewish, so as a non-Jew I also reflected on that with like the persons on the field, and
Thank you.
Lisa?
Yeah, thank you. I have a question about the musical aesthetics, and knowing that musical aesthetics in modern day synagogues are a big topic of discussion, and especially kind of power dynamics of older Nusach, kind of embodied mimetic learning traditions, and the more renewal, American reform, kind of popular aesthetics. And I was wondering whether, these were more kind of already renewal communities, but you also mentioned Nusach, so like traditional cantillation. So I was wondering like whether you encountered these kind of discussions also happening in an online context, or how does the moving online change also these discussions?
Okay, so let me think shortly about it. There are discussions within the service, so there are sometimes changing cantors or several cantors at the Zoom call, so they bring other kind of nusach or other kind of model framework with it, but it's more like an open exchange. Within the synagogue, there aren't such power dynamics that you have in like between denominations or other communities. But I'm still thinking on it in my fieldwork.
Okay, I think with this question we'll actually finish this session. Let's thank to Samuel and others.
Thank you so much.
So now we have a short break. Eva, do we have some announcement? Because I know that Mojca Piškor is not here. So shall we then start on time and then just finish earlier? So, yeah, Mojca Piškor is not here.
Yes,
yeah.
So if we start 5,
Okay.
then we finish
Yeah.
around 6, which means that we have 1 hour
Break. Yeah.
before the puppet show. So that's fine. Or we can also make the cookie break a bit longer, like some half an hour, and decide then.
țătra. So we have a last session for today, and we have two presentations. The first presenter is Oldrich Podberadzki from Charles University in Prague, where he's teaching ethnomusicology. The title of his presentation is From Fantasy to Fantastic Folklore, New Shifts of Moravian Folklore Music, the case of 𝐄𝐿 collective.
Yeah, thank you for this introduction. So welcome, and I thank you to be so brave to remain for this last session. So first, I have a thing to confess that I'm not a folklorist, but I'm a mere ethnomusicologist, and this paper actually has a connection to our ethnomusicological field research done in 2009 in a small South Moravian city called 𝐿𝐿, which in English means noise, so this is kind of a strange connection. And my current research in its very beginning, and I would be really grateful for any of your insights or also some tips for the literature or something like this. Back in the 2009, we followed the path of Vladimír Ulehla, a Czech or Moravian biologist and also collector of Moravian folklore songs, who in his book 𝐿𝐵𝐵𝐵 píseň, which is a live song in English from 1949, contemplates about the shifts of the Moravian folklore music and the preservation societies. And also on the influence of these Prague tides started in Strážnice in holiday of 1910 with Slovácko Folklore Preservation Circle. And as I confessed before, Slovácko Circle in Slovácko town means this regional town, means decrease of this Slováckonec in this area. But that was how the circus was justified. It served to save the culture and revive the culture, and quote from Ulehla 1949. 2009 was also a year we went with Professor Zuzana Jurková, and I went to my very first field research into 𝐿𝐿, and we all were very surprised how the folklore music there was thriving, and at the time, and still is thriving until this day, and how many forms the folklore can take. It's not only the traditional costumes and traditional music, but as Professor Jurková wrote in the article after the field research, various traditional genres are documented from 19th and first half of the 20th century, are disappearing from this area, are getting new forms and functions. The fact of active making music and its major role in communities' life is still apparent, end quote. And for me, this major role of this shift was the psytrance and rap crew called PS Crew, abbreviation for Slovácko Utrakve group, but this has nothing to do with religion. Actually, the Utrakve they received wine and pies, and musically they made hip-hop music in Southern Moravian dialect, and actually made fun of living in a small rural town, and also made these UV decorations for the psytrance parties with traditional Moravian motifs, as we can see here. So here they are having this inspired costumes and also do these UV decorations. And this was basically the first time I came across the shifts of the traditional folklore music, and it was the stepping stone for this paper. So thank you, Zuzana, for taking me for that field research. So now let's stay in the South Moravian region, and let's go to Brno, where 𝐿𝐵𝐵𝐵 𝐿𝐿, or as it translates to one tribe, is settled. So this is the Brno, and it's with almost 400,000 inhabitants. It's the second largest city in Czech Republic, situated in the South Moravian region. That's why the Brno is much more connected to the folklore music than the capital city Prague, and it had big folklore tradition even before the World War II and also during the communist era. Even today, Brno is hosting many folklore events, such as an international folklore festival, municipal folklore festival, and etc., and has more than 20 folklore groups, and many of them are funded by the city itself. But there is one particular place in Brno which plays a huge role in the story of the 𝐄𝐿 collective and also this paper, and that is Kamenná kolonie, or family Kamenka, in translation stone colony. And it's a former illegal settlement of poor brickyard workers that emerged in 1925. So until this day, this area is more like the village in the heart of the city than the city district, as we would say and as we would predict. And during the 1960s and 1970s, this so-called village in the city, as we can see on the pictures, and actually it's right in the middle of the Brno. Yeah? You can just walk there from the very historical city. And during the 1960s and 70s, this so-called village was a refuge for artists and musicians, and that's the way how Kamenka stayed until this day. It has more than 130 houses, just one road, has no canalization system, no public transport, but it has a pub called Dagbar, which is a center of a social life in the area. Kamena Colonia plays a huge role in the _𝐭𝐡 story, as most of the musicians are living there. Kamenka also has also folklore women choir called 𝟑𝟖 and about the cultural role and importance and influence of this area I will talk a little bit later. Now to the history of the _𝐭𝐡 collective. We can see the totem here, and the _𝐭𝐡 started actually as a group of friends going to. It ended up as a fictional ethnographic exhibition about this orc tribe, and we can see some exhibits here. So there is the guy in the mask of the orc. There is the orc chieftain Hears, and also this is the scene inspired by the Repin's famous painting Replight of the Zaporožan Cossacks. This photography work started in 2016, and there's where the musical part of the _𝐭𝐡 starts, as they also formed an org band that would accompany this photographic project. They played in costumes, and as the leader of the band, Tibor Ostrý, says, well, if I simplify it, the quote, we are circling around dark folk genre, fantasy ambient, and world music, end quote. After the first performance, they decided they will keep the band together and decided to record an org album and accompany it with audiovisual project. The first album was named 𝐿HA, the Fog. Here we go. This is the logo of the band of the project. As the proper orcs, their music was full of throat singing, exalted vocals, field recordings, and it was mostly based on rhythm. And all the lyrics were actually sang in the black speech of Mordor, the artificial language made by J.R.R. Tolkien for his books Lord of the Rings. Most of the percussion were custom-made, and it was self-released in 2018. We can see how they got dressed on stage and performed the 𝐿HA, the Fog said, with all the horns and everything. And I will now play a short excerpt of the song. Yeah, this is the black speech of Mordor. Yeah. The orc language. So at that time, _𝐭𝐡 were 5 people, and the concept was clear, as the band says in one of the interviews for the one Czech webzine. Album The Fog has a story concept. We had a story that we wanted to put to music, and which connected the whole project also with the photographs. And for each part of the story, we wrote a song so they can tell the story to the audience. That's why there is in Bot song just the breathing of the messengers, or in Maukum song, you can hear orders given to the warriors. In other parts, some particular instrument represented persons in the story, such as two-mouth harps. Two-mouth illustrates a quarrel between one of the messengers and the chieftain of the tribe. After the release of the album, the band played on various occasions, and also, and not surprisingly, on metal and dark folk festivals. In 2018, they published a book, A Story of One Tribe, with illustrations and the story of one tribe. This time the book was written in Czech, not in the black speech of Morde. Until 2020, they stopped playing as an org band, and made some collaboration with Brno metal bands, and also made a song for exhibition Celts under the Pálava, which was released as in the Regional Museum of Mikulov. After that, the band started to stagnate and was at the very verge of breakup, and COVID pandemic was just one of the reasons. Stibor, a desperate leader of the band, they came with one of these old stories he wrote for his little daughter, a fairy tale about lost winter. This story was very well acclaimed by the band, and they started to prepare a new album based on this story. And that's where also the story of the album called Bassen starts. This is the cover for the album. And just as the first album, The Fog, the second album named Bassen, in inter-Slavic language, I will get to it a little bit later. The inter-Slavic language, it's a fairy tale. And it's based on this story, and this story was actually released in a form of audiobook in Czech language, and it's called About the Lost Winter, before the actual album Bassen was recorded. And this story, this fairy tale, is inspired by old Slavic fairy tales and mythological tales, and tells the story about Miss Winter, who was kidnapped by the Soul Brothers, and then the winter itself didn't come to the mortal realm. The hero of the fairy tale is accompanied by the fox, who is also some sort of his tutor, and comes to his journey to save the Miss Winter and get the circle of nature back to order once again. Basically, the same story is told in the album, and the leader, the band had a clear vision also about the time period he wanted to be his story. Quote, the fairy tale about the lost winter was very slightly put in the Hallstatt era. That means all the Iron Age. When we started to work with the original story with the band, they moved it somewhere into the early Middle Ages before the Christianization of our land. So we speak about 8th century after Christ. But it's not important. It's not historical music, but more of a feeling of the past. It is much more mythological than a historical character. And also here comes the folklore inspiration into play. And that's why we need to get back to the Kamenná kolonie, we talked before, and its customs. As I said before, Kamenná kolonie actually has a history of 100 years. The brickyard workers were coming from various lands there, and there was actually no connection to any Moravian folklore, so to say, if we are talking about the music, with the costumes and so on. That changed some 15 years ago, when the community living in the Kamenná kolonie actually came with the idea of inventing their own folklore and also their own folklore traditions. So for more than a decade, there are celebratory occasions such as Christmas markets, May celebration, also with Stefanfest held in October, and these occasions are also calling for a special dress and special music. So the community actually invented their own folklore costumes to wear something special to celebration. So as we can see here, this is the so invented Moravian costumes, especially for the Kamenná kolonie 15 years ago. So there are some. And it's an amalgam of a traditional South Moravian folklore costume with some new, I would say, pan-Slavic influences, as they also put it. We can see it on this women choir called 𝐿ajerky. And also at the time, this 10-piece women choir start to perform traditional Moravian songs and also some more songs from Slavic folklore, including songs from Slovakia, also Ukraine, and so on. And that's the moment where we return back to the album Bassen. As I told you before, Bassen inspired by various types of Slavic folklore, and mostly the South Moravian one. But if we would look at the instrumentation of the album, we must say it's not because the instrumentation, because it's rather strange. On the album is various instruments used, and the band itself grew from a 5-piece to a 12-piece collective, including 4 girls from this 𝐿ajerky women choir, and that is also given by the fact that the album itself was prepared during the pandemic times, and as Stibor, the leader of the band, says, quote, "We have plenty of time to spend in a studio and went fully epic with this one." No one really cared about the live performance at the time. End quote. The band still uses custom-made percussion from the folk era, but also implements numerous instruments from all over the world. Irish bouzouki, Turkish saz, overtone flutes, Bulgarian double flute, mouth harps, guitar, electric guitar, and also the thing called juhiko, a hybrid between Finnish juhiko and Mongolian mohinkur, made from old wardrobe with strings made out of alpinist ropes played with a bow. So the instrumentation itself is not a vessel for any kind of the folklore influence, and it's only the vessel for the timbre of the music they call Pan-Slavic folklore. We can see the juhiko here. So this is the ropes actually for the mountains and everything. And but the juhiko is not the only invented thing. The Basni album. The band is dressed in very stylized costumes. They met many similarities of the invented folklore costumes of Kamenná Kolonie, as we can see at the women choir of the band, who are also who else but very known Šlajerky. Šlajerky are playing the key role in the connecting the tribal and Pan-Slavic folklore-inspired music and the Moravian folklore itself. They had an opportunity to actually write the voice parts of one song called Velká sala, the big hall, and the whole collective liked it so much they were incorporated into the whole album as the Moravian folklore element. We can see the costumes here. We can see the costumes here. Basically, some sort the same as the invented Kamenná Kolonie costumes, and also we can hear the Moravian influence in the Velká sala song. I see some confused faces here also because the language, and language is the other thing we need to talk about because it has a very important role. After the Black Speech of Morde, the collective decided that the new album will be in Inter-Slavic. So Inter-Slavic is actually new language invented by the worldwide group of linguists in 2017 as in some sort of Slavic Esperanto. And the collective decided to use it for various reasons, and due to that it was a tradition from the first album to use some sort of invented language, and also the collective didn't want to take especially one particular folklore tradition and use it as a frame. As they say, the Inter-Slavic also sound ancient, so it fitted to the timelessness of the fairy tale theme. This is the Jeden Kmen on stage, where we can see all the costumes, and also I will play the excerpt for the song called Slnečná kareta. See and also hear the music and also the costumes are very stylized, very inspired by something, but also they wanted to have it some like timeless, this mythological fairy tale setting, and I think that's the time to conclude all this. And as we would close the circle and get to the beginning, to the Vladimír Ulehla quote about preserving the Moravian folklore, there are many shifts of this folklore actually alive, and as a source of inspiration to either other genres like the PS crew and the hip hop in the Moravian dialect, or as an inspirational fundament for so-called world music. In the case of Jeden Kmen collective, we can see how the Moravian folklore can shift and also be incorporated in some sort of Pan-Slavic invented folklore, and with also used with the Pan-Slavic language called Inter-Slavic. I would end my presentation with a quote from Ctibor Ostrý, the leader of the band, I must say I deeply respect everyone who is involved in the tradition in its pure form, so it is preserved for us all. But I also need to say that I'm not that kind of person. I like to dig into things, look from other perspectives on them, and also see the wider context, including folklore tradition. I don't see it as something untouchable. I like various revivals and experimental approach, because that means that Moravian folklore can still inspire and lead to other creation, and thus is not dead. So, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Now, I have to stand to see everybody here. So, we had from fantasy to fantastic folklore and to invented languages and so on. So, the floor is open. Yes, Brita?
Fascinating material again. So, can you say something about the audience reception and what kind of scene is surrounding these bands? And what about, you could say, the more traditional, in quotation marks, performer scenes? How are they reacting? Are there also debates on authenticity going on?
Absolutely. The thing is that also I didn't have a time in my presentation to some sort mention the aftermath of the album, because actually nobody from the folklore scene or the folk scene would like say anything about it, because I don't know if they don't want to do anything with it, or they actually don't know about it, because this audience for this band is mostly from this before era, and this more metal audience, and also this like alternative dark music audience, and also they didn't acclaim it very well because it's not so dark. So they are on somewhere between, not to be acclaimed by the metal community so much as they did before, and still not to be acclaimed by the folklore community, because it's something not so folklore, I would say. So actually there is no questions about the invented traditions and so on, because there is actually no discussion about that. And but the audience for this is either my open-minded metalheads, and also these fantasy guys. Yeah, they're also going to this concert in some sort of fantasy costumes, but they also some sort plays the game of the busing, and also I have some. I didn't include it into my presentation, but actually the audience comes to this kind of performances in invented costumes themselves. Yeah, so it's a very, I would say, interesting scene, and also the audience plays the game, but it's like scattered from various genres, various social groups, and so on.
Okay, Stefano. Here. Here first. Rita, here first.
No, I also have a question. Thank you for the presentation. I also have a question about reception, but mostly based on the Tolkien imaginary.
Okay.
I mean, I'm a huge Tolkien fan, and I'm an anarchist. So, but in Italy, everything gets drowned in polemics and everything. And until some years ago, Tolkien imaginary was very much linked with the right wing.
Okay.
While in the United States, it was more easily recognized as like a trans heritage, but in Italy it was very much related with identitarian politics and warlike imaginary and everything. So I would like to know how this Tolkien imaginary fits in the local debate, or if it's being addressed as such.
Yeah, I think that's not debated as a political very much, but more like inspired music and so on. So I don't think it's very connected to politics at all, but yeah, it's still alive there, and also there's lots of this fantasy, like the conventions and so on. So yeah, the heritage is still alive, and also as I put it to my research, lots of the fans of _𝐤𝐴𝐴𝐿 would say, "Oh, you're not doing Tolkien anymore. Yeah, so we're not listening to you anymore. Yeah, so you're not orcs," and so on. So yeah, also the aftermath of the album was like, okay, well, you kind of deceived us, so on. So yeah, but the Tolkien theme, I wouldn't say it's very political there. It's like more open to everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really like this. This reminds me of, we did some studies of medieval music, but medieval music in Sweden, where we found this was kind of a eclectic medievalism, where you took whatever you had that could sound a bit medieval, and it worked. And the bands that did this in Visby, an old medieval town in Sweden, they got followers, so it became sort of a trend to put whatever, could be Chinese lute or, well, do you have some sort of followers following up with?
Yeah, I think so, because also these LARPs, these fantasy battles and so on, the people are connected also to this medieval scene or living history scene. And yeah, there are many bands actually that what you are talking about. Yeah, just put some Irish bouzouki, a djembe, and you have a medieval band. Yeah, so yeah, and I'm playing, I don't know, Hermannelik, like everybody plays the song, the Swedish song about the troll. So yeah, we have it, but yes, also this band, I would say that the influences are from these bands, but as the Tibor says, we are not trying to be historical, and we put just anything what we like, and also make our strange instruments. But yeah, there is some sort of the scene, not these medieval accurate bands, but more like medieval, I would say, popular bands going from castle to castle and playing these medieval songs and on not so medieval instruments. So yeah, the scene is there, and I think it's connected also with this genre, with this style.
Thank you. Fascinating. I just comment. So say, I think this is a general phenomenon, because we also have pan-Baltic movement as a pan-Slavic. Sure. Also, we have this kind of festival where you can hear pan-Baltic music, and everything is the same. Different strange instruments, created garments, costumes, basis on mythology, different styles of music mixed, rock, especially metal, and folk. So let's cooperate.
Yeah, definitely, and I think, thank you for this comment, that I didn't include this also to my presentation, because I think there's some sort of trend now given by the Vardruna like 10, 15 years ago, also with the series Vikings, and suddenly everybody is a Viking, have this Viking tattoo, they have this braids in her head, and they're there. And they know nothing about Viking culture, actually. But yeah, this is a trend about this also Norse mythology and Norse mythological bands, so on. And this is very connected to the black metal from the 90s. So yeah, there is big connection between the black metal, Norse mythology, and Norse mythological, I would say, folk bands. And now the trend, because Vardruna became so popular that everybody now is like, oh, let's have this dark folk Viking band because we can make money. So yeah, I think actually there is some trend, but I haven't seen the trend like this in Yerenkman. Yeah, I think this is something very unique, and this is why they are not famous so much, I would say so. So yeah, definitely thank you for this comment. And actually, yeah, I would say it's a trendy thing now. Yeah, this pun. Anything sort of thing. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
So now we go to the second presentation, and we have two speakers. Stefano Portelli and Helen Susheve. Okay. So Helen is a musicologist, postdoc, and at the University of Brussels, while Stefano, he is a urban anthropologist affiliated with the University of Leicester and is based in Rome. The title of their presentation is the Knawa Rumi, I hope I spelled it well, album, researching Moroccan ritual music in Italy through a collaborative recording. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, while you're installing everything, maybe, can you see well the screen? Is it? Yeah. So we wanted to first, maybe I will put the chronometer. Let's see. Chronometer. Yes. Oh, don't die. Okay. I'd like to make this communication with you. So we are very happy to be here and to be the second duo of this day. And we wanted also to thank the organizers and the local committee that are hosting us, because we are very, very happy to be here in this wonderful space that is inspiring, actually. So let's first start with a musical audio. Doesn't seem to work. I don't speak Italian.
It's already at the end.
اللهم صل عليك يا رسول الله والله صل عليك يا رسول الله يا جاد يا مولاي محمد.
مولاي إدريس عمرت رجال البلاد يا الوليد فلان. قالوا لي يا سيرتو مولاي إدريس عمرت رجال البلاد يا الوليد فلان. جالا بطي ترى بيلا نيه لا إله إلا الله حبيبها يا رسول الله.
عشرة باتيتا ويا جارة باتيتا. Ogni volta che sbarco in Europa mi fanno sentire che sono dell'Africa. Quando ci va per sentirsi in vita, lasciando terra, famiglia per la libertà. Sala banchizzara, la buona lei, buona lei, la la. Al-Aziza Rasulullah, sala banchizzara, la buona lei, buona lei, la la. Al-Aziza Rasulullah.
So this was an extract from the album we'll talk about today. First, let me introduce the Gnawa community. Maybe you're not familiar with them. So it's a Moroccan Brotherhood community that is present in all north of Morocco, and it's linked to many and to this culture of Moroccan spiritual brotherhoods, like the Hamadsha, the Jilala, that are very broad in North Africa, and that we will also discover in one of the movies that will be screened in the next days, Musem by Antonio Baldassare. And so Gnawa culture was also recognized as intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO in 2019 in Morocco. And the interesting thing for us about Gnawa music, it's diasporic music, so it comes from the slavery from sub-Saharan Africa to Morocco, and so it's a music about displacement, about slavery, about exile. And Stefano and I are very interested in the relation between material structures and musical content, so that's why we started this project. Gnawa is a very well documented phenomenon in Morocco. It's linked to a lot of trance phenomena and ritual music that are studied in Morocco, but also more broadly in North Africa, Middle East, and we will hear a lot of communications about them. I'm thinking of Silvia Bruni and Sara Antonini in the next days. It's also documented in relation to festivalization of the practices, Morocco and blackness, the history of Morocco, the history of slavery. But Gnawa musical practices are not studied outside of Morocco, though we know that there are a lot of communities. So there are some mentions in France in some studies. There are mentions in Barcelona, in Montreal, in Italy, but there was no comprehensive study until I started my PhD in Brussels, in Molenbeek, with the Gnawa community there. And so by the time I started to meet all the researchers working on Gnawa in the diaspora, and we organized a first study day, Musique Gnawa en Diaspora, in 2019. And I think it's important to study the music, the Gnawa music in its diasporic dimension, because recently Hicham Haidi published an article in the periodical Souffle in last year, where he advocates for revisiting Gnawa history in a perspective of decolonization, because he says that Gnawa history is mostly written among Western academic networks. But I also think that the study of music in the diaspora is a way also of revisiting the literature, and also to nuance the East-West dichotomies, North-South, black-white, and to go a bit further in the oppositions and enrich the debate on the decolonization. So, talking about migrant musics in Italy, there's a lot of literature. We already heard some communications today about it, so we won't go deeper in that. But the first book that I would like to mention is Alessandra Ciucci, The Voice of the Rural, that was published 2 years ago. That was the first book about migrant Moroccan music in Italy, and well, it was, I don't know, beautiful. Also, but a bit, yes, well, I don't know. Let's continue.
Very much in the spirit of what
yeah,
we are
that's
talking
what
about.
I want.
Yes. Beautiful book, absolutely. Yes, I can go on talking a little bit about Gnawa music in Italy, which we think it can be very much related to what we call the second folk revival of the 90s. So we all came to know, people of my generation came to know Gnawa in the moment in which a lot of urban Italians acknowledged the presence of mostly southern and mostly rural heritage, and began visiting festivals and feasts and rituals that take place in faraway places, and got involved in tradition much more than in, let's say, contemporary, I would say, consumistic culture. No? So the Gnawa in the 90s was very much part of the interest of urbanites in, for example, in trance, in rituals, in possession, in tarantella, in pizzica tarantata, and in a series of things that were seen like related to the past, and that Gnawa very much seemed as bringing back to life. No? So there was an attention towards this that came much from, we would say, from an La Passadian perspective, like of a pan-Mediterranean, pan-trans idea that spans from Taranta to raves. I don't know if you remember the 90s. I remember them very much. So there were Gnawa rituals being celebrated by Italian people calling Moroccan masters to celebrate things, mostly in not really central places. We think that the first Gnawa ritual took place in 𝐭𝐡, is a so-called casa laboratorio in the middle of Umbria, by Franco Lorenzoni, who is a famous pedagogist in Italy. Other Gnawa were invited in the 2000s in Bologna by the Ivan Illich School of Music. So there was some attention that later waned with the 2010. And so this is this kind of going back to seeing what is of the Gnawa today and what was of the Gnawa in the 90s, for me was part of a research I engaged in through a Marie Curie grant that I got between 2017 and 2020, which was about the interaction between displacement, diaspora, and ritual, and especially with the Gnawa at its center. So I was working in this, and I visited the Essaouira, and it was in Essaouira where also the conference of the ICTM in 2018 took place. Hélène was in Essaouira for the conference. We had this very casual meeting, this random convergence of different researchers, and we were both in touch with a person, with I would say a young scholar and musician from Casablanca, Khalil Munji, he's in the third photo, who put us in touch, put us in contact. And this gave place to a series of coincidences. No? So when I returned to I knew the work that Hélène was doing in Brussels with the CD Jola, which was already a very rigorous work about Gnawa music in Brussels. So she had already worked, you had already released the CDs, CD if I'm not wrong. And well, in those conversations in Essaouira, we had the idea of trying to do something in Italy, because I was beginning to meet Gnawa people in Italy, and I had the impression that due to the specificity of the different diasporas in Belgium and in Italy, the Gnawa community in Italy was very different. So the music was different and the rituals were different. So comparing the two countries would give us insight of what is happening actually in Europe currently with the Gnawa. It took us 3 years to really get into doing something. And during those 3 years, I worked with a Gnawa master in Rome through Luciana Manca, who will also present in a couple of days here at the festival, the conference. I'm always confusing festivals and conferences. I don't know if it's the hit I got, but I sometimes do it. So we had no money for this. I already finished my Marie Curie in 2020, so I had no funds. So we had to rely on contacts and ideas, extemporary relationships. And we put in touch, basically, the help that Hélène got from the Accademia Belgica in Rome. She got a 3 months residency with a series of contacts I was making in Italy through the contacts I got during the Marie Curie. So there was already a label interested in migrant music through Circolo Gianni Bosio, which is an association I was already very much linked to in Rome, and that had already produced records on migrant music in Italy. And this convergence led to 3 days of recordings in Rome that Hélène will talk about. And especially to a concept that we began exploring, which was the idea of Rumi. So I want to say 2 words about this, then I pass you to go to the next step. But Gnawa Rumi is something that we came up with. It's not an EMI concept. we introduced it. So Rumi is part of a dichotomy that it's very much present in Moroccan culture. Many products, many physical objects in Morocco are classified as bildi or Rumi. I'd spent some time living and working in Morocco as Hélène did, and we found very interesting this dichotomy about that related with things that belong to the country. Bildi is the country, so from the land, and things that come from Rumi. Rumi is Rome, in fact, and refers to the Byzantium Empire. So the Rum are basically the Crusaders. So you can have Zit Bildi, which is the oil of the peasant, and Zit Rumi, which is the oil that you buy in the supermarket. So you have Honey can be Bildi and can be Rumi. No? So in fact, we were not, this was a bit of our intention was not working on original Bildi Gnawa from the country, but of what was happening with the Gnawa in the land of the Rumi. And obviously, we were in Rome. We recorded in Rome, so the word Rumi had a lot of meanings at that moment. And we also like very much the idea of diaspora. Maybe we can go on, since we had a very interesting presentation on this.
So through this project, we went to meet a lot of musicians, Gnawa musicians. We tried to contact, because I don't live in Italy, Stefano was the Italian contact. So during these 3 months, I tried to gather all the knowledge that we could to find musicians. And in the end, we realized that the Gnawa community in Italy is actually not very numerous. So we met only 5 musicians that are calling themselves Gnawa. It's really different, for example, than Brussels, where you have 50 musicians and a real community that is very active. All these musicians are scattered in Italy, so there's no community, there's no ritual life, and they also are from various Moroccan cities. So one of them is from Essaouira, two of them are from Casablanca, Derzak is from Marrakesh, so they are all from different parts of Morocco, which is not the same in Brussels, where they all come from the same region, which is north of Morocco. So since there is no ritual life, no community, the musicians are having their own musical projects, and that's how they make themselves not famous, but known at least. So they consider themselves as fannan, artists, and not as workers like many of the Gnawa do in Morocco. The musicians in Italy, they don't play in Moroccan weddings, at the contrary of musicians who have the community life and the ritual life. In Italy, since they are musicians, artists, they don't play in weddings. And also what was something a bit surprising is that they are all documented, so there are no musicians that we met that have no papers. Since in Brussels, the half of the musicians don't have papers, so the difference is completely huge. They speak various languages, so all of them master Italian at least, and Arabic, of course. And some did high studies, even one of them wrote a book. So here are some portraits that we won't have the time to go deep in details, but you can just have a look. So the CD was recorded in 3 days in a studio in Rome that Stefano knew. So it was quite easy to record, actually. I wasn't expecting that. And maybe to go a bit faster, because we don't have a lot of time anymore. So the set list is very interesting because it mixes traditional Gnawa music, so very traditional arrangements, but also more fusion arrangements with new instruments like electric guitar, percussions. We also have a synthesizer. And we also could receive from the musicians as gift music from musical projects that they had outside of the recordings that we made, but the groups, the bands were wanting to offer us that music to be on the CD as well. So it's a very diverse album, and to give you short examples of what it looks like. So here's a song called Uma Baniya that was produced by Noreddin Fatih in another project that mixes Gnawa with Taranta. So from southern Italy. It's also voilà.
Sento tamburi lontani sopra la voce assai potenti, vi arrivare bella gente.
So that's an example, and the other example is the song Sudani Manayo, that is a traditional Gnawa song, but that was played by one of the musicians while he was collaborating with a school in Bologna. So he taught the song to children, and in the song you will hear him singing the solo part and the children responding and clapping hands.
Sassaci manayo, Shashiati banda. Sudani manayo, Shashiati banda. Sassaci manayo, Shashiati banda. Sudani manayo, Shashiati banda.
And the last song of the CD is very interesting as well for us because it was recorded and produced by Antonio Baldassare, who's a researcher on Gnawa music that we know mainly as a researcher, but who for this CD wanted really to add something from him. So, yeah.
Yeah, this, for us, it has big importance because, well, the record begins with Reda Zin, who is a musician and I would say a decolonial intellectual in Bologna from Morocco, who improvised a Gnawa sentence in Italian, which is one of the very few examples that we have of Gnawa in a European language. And the record ends with an Italian ethnomusicologist singing in Arabic with a very strong accent from Abruzzo. So it's like, really, I will end up talking a little bit about the messiness of the project, thanking Professor Solomon for the concept, because the impression that we had with this record, in which, as we said, we were not looking for the building, we were not looking for the authentic Gnawa, which in some way was what you were looking for in Belgium, but for the contemporary variations and stories of the Gnawa. Well, yes, there were a couple of things we wanted to say about some concerts we did after the presentation of the book, after the presentation of the, I call it book because there are 60 pages of explanation in Italian, English, and Arabic besides the CD. So it's more a book than a CD. But yeah, we presented in Colle Longo, in Abruzzo, and in Rome during the conference of ISMEO, of the Institute of Middle Eastern and Oriental Studies. So the impression that we have is that regarding to other works that had been done on the Gnawa, I think that what the present situation of the Gnawa in Italy can inspire us, it's precisely a sensation of messiness, no? In which there is, in a moment in which, for example, in Morocco, Gnawa is very much subject to the process of heritageization and essentialism and even nationalistic celebration. In the diaspora and in Italy in particular, it may retain some of the stigma and some of the invisibility, of the complexity that it had before UNESCO arrived. So it may be more buildy than the buildy, no? In some ways. At the same time, it obviously came up, also referring to Professor Macchiarella's idea of shall we help or shall we just look? We obviously helped. So this was our product. So we had been pushing it to happen. We took the musician, paid them the tickets with our money to bring them together. So we created something that was not there. So are we influencing this or not? Well, the contrary, the opposite of this was that we always felt that our obsession to categorize, clarify, explain was in conflict with the messiness of the Gnawa community, no? And I'm inspired here in this museum. I go very quickly, I'm sorry if I'm taking more time. But I mean, as an Italian of Sicilian origins, I feel how I was very much into puppets when I was a kid. And I'm only recently recognizing how much puppets are a huge celebration of crusades and us versus them, no? So there's a colonial thought underlying all our attempts of intercultural hybridity and everything. And while in the 90s and the 2000s, maybe we were not very aware of this, we were looking at how to bridge the gap. Probably in this moment, we are going much more towards doing things together regardless of it's us or them, no? And the impression that we had from the Gnawa is that maybe more than a technique for trance, anthropologists are obsessed by trance in the Gnawa. All the songs that we have in Gnawa Rumi, none of them is a trance song. None is for trance, it's just for playing. So we had the impression that maybe Gnawa should be seen much more as a technique of keeping messiness alive in a world of increasing frontiers and clearly defined boundaries than a technique for whatever, like keeping trance and everything. And well, maybe I can finish with since we're over time, with the last sentence that we put in our explanation of in the CDs. There are all the songs, the translation, Arabic, Italian, English, and everything. And we tried to finish with this sentence in which we said, we believe that Italy and Europe need more Gnawa, as they need pizzica tarantata and all the rituals that the working classes elaborated to manage diversity, social suffering, exclusion, displacement, and placemaking, community, and collective joy. With the CD, we wish to make it grow. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, a collaborative recording. We have some minutes for discussions, questions, remarks. Yes, Salwa. Please hear Salwa first. And then, yeah. Yes.
What a wonderful project, really. It's very inspiring and touching as well, because I see how involved you are as people, you know. And this is, I mean, we're all in this because we are passionate and we have relationships with the musicians with whom we cooperate. And I just wonder whether you took the CD book back to Morocco, and if so, what was the reaction? And also whether your musician collaborators and friends commented anything about, well, how would this be received in Morocco? I mean, how do they see it vis-a-vis their Moroccan experience? And the other question is, if you took it back to Morocco, what was the reaction?
We are still looking forward to bring it to Morocco. There was a pandemic and then an earthquake. So it's like never the moment to do it. And maybe we put a lot of expectation in what we could do in Morocco with this, but for the moment we are like following the flow.
Yeah, and from my own experience in Morocco, there is very little interest of what happens outside Morocco, because it's not as authentic and not as pure as the Moroccan tradition. And even in Belgium, when I started my PhD, the musicians were telling me, why do you work on us? Why don't you go to Morocco? Why do you want to know our story? It's not interesting. The real one is in Morocco. And the last thing I can add, if I still have time, is that the Essaouira Gnawa Festival has been aware of the presence of Gnawa diasporas for a long time, and they are always mirroring that someday they will organize something about Gnawa diasporas, because there is Brussels, there is Italy, but there is Montreal, there is Barcelona, there are many places, and it would be great to have that kind of festive moment there, but they are not interested, or they don't show any interest. I don't know what's the reason, but yeah, that's a bit sad for us as well.
Yeah, yes, I wanted to know something more about this definition of Gnawa musicians, because if I think to Nureddin Fatih, for example, I know him from many other from at least one project of electronic music, for example. So I could define him more as a cosmopolitan musician, but not a Gnawa musician. So.
Yes, well, Nureddin's most recent project is called Tara Gnawa, which is Tarantella in Gnawa. So the definition of having to do with Gnawa is emic in this case. But yes, you're right. I mean, he's from the north, he's from the mountain. His parents, his father and maybe grandfather were Aisawa, if I'm not wrong. So he doesn't belong to the Gnawa tradition. Reda himself, he's Casablanca musician who discovered Gnawa in the diaspora in Paris. Amin also comes from a fusion band and discovered. Abdellah Jarrar is, if there's something like pure, then is a pure Gnawa Kuyu who made the whole initiation with an important master in Essaouira, and Abdelrazak Telmi is the most ancient Gnawa in Italy at the moment. So everybody has different relationship with the original tradition, but as we see in other situations, diaspora mixes the cards, no? So I've been yesterday to a Tamil ceremony in the center of Palermo, which was not officiated by Brahmins, because there's no Brahmins here. So this is interesting, no? In diaspora, some things can flow better than
And I have to say also that even in Morocco, this question of being a Gnawa or not being a Gnawa is a category that is very broad, that is always discussed. It's also a question of legitimacy, and saying that somebody is not a Gnawa is a way to say that he's not as important as you, even if he's been initiated, but his family, for example, is not a Gnawa family. So in this project, we accepted everybody that was saying, they don't even say I'm a Gnawa, or I play Gnawa music. It's more that kind of thing.
There are also 2 Italian musicians that play. I mean, we played, we sang. We are not Gnawa at all. but there were two Italian musicians who were used to playing with gnawa, and we thought that their contribution was important as well. It was not our thought, it was a collective thinking. No? So yeah, this is what we consider blurring categories. You know?
Thank you for this beautiful project. I'm very interested in the song you recorded with the children, and I would like to ask how the musician teach to children, and maybe in the class there was children from Morocco, I don't know, and how children react.
From what I can say, because we didn't record the piece, so the piece was offered by the musician to us, but he had recorded it previously within the school, so he's not a teacher, but he teaches in school, so occasionally. And he had this project in the classes with, I must say that I don't know in which neighborhood he works, but I think it's a neighborhood where there are a lot of immigrants and Moroccan children as well. So that's also this question of representation in the
Nina, and he's very active, both culturally and politically, and he's teaching Gnawa and Afrobeat in the Ivan Illich School of Music in Bologna. And besides this, he's also done this laboratories in school, workshops in school, in which the idea was sharing migrants' music in Italian schools. So the song is in the record because we recorded most of the songs that are in the album, but we also asked the musician to send us or to give us tracks that they already recorded either in concert or in studio, and we worked a little bit to make it more homogeneous. Well, the sound technician who did it, but the idea was giving a sense of all that was going on, from improvisation in studio to workshops in schools.
Okay. Marco, last question.
Thank you for this insights into this in your work and this project. My question might come over as a critical question, but it's actually an attempt to understand our own positionalities in such collaborations. So I'm thinking about because you mentioned the recent, let's say, post-colonial awareness in respect to research like that. And I'm thinking about the coloniality inherent in migrant-related ethnographic research and the way that often white, post-colonial, liberal, leftist researcher advocate for brown, POC, often Muslim, othered people, and how these projects, as important and necessary they are, have some kind of coloniality inherent into them, and how you would theorize that or how you dealt with it.
No, I mean, this is the essence of anthropology, I would say, since Morgan. I mean, there are two strands in anthropology. One is collaborating with colonial power. The other one is contrasting colonial powers. We had examples of both of them, and we had clear examples of both of them, an example of a lot of ambiguity between the two of them. I have names for each of the shades of gray, that you have between these two polarities. We have to deal with it. So it's obvious that we advocate for an anthropology that breaks borders and gives relevance to what breaks border, not for an anthropology that helps to colonize and to study people for the sake of governing them. So this is very clear political positioning. We can't do all the job. We can set our part, and the rest is for the rest of us. No? So I think that in some way, sometimes it feels very strange to come and talk, me and her, about other people, but anthropology has always been like this. So people talking about the others. So this has a lot of contradiction, because luckily now there's a lot of others talking about themselves. And I think that the future of anthropology is blurring these discourses and just like trying to forget when we are ourselves and when we are the others, and just creating a common discourse.
Okay, thank you very much then. So, I think we have half an hour now. Yeah, okay, half an hour break and